just in case you had any doubts. So, welcome everyone to our first colloquium. This is a colloquium jointly hosted by the Colorado School of Mines, Humanitarian Engineering and Science program, and Western Colorado University's Masters in Environmental Management program. So in this new moment, in this current moment, we're reminded of how important it is to think about ethical, thoughtful action as scientists and as engineers and as practitioners of all sorts, right? As scholars, as students, as teachers. And that's one of the things that our new program here at Mines is focused on doing in a methodical and thoughtful way. One of the reasons we're so happy to partner with folks like the team at Western. So one of the things that we've been talking about, and we're going to continue to talk about, is collaboration and participation. Those are important themes in our studies and our research and our practice, and in the work of our guest today. We're incredibly lucky to have Dr. Corrie Knapp from the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming come to talk with us in this inaugural first colloquium. So as you may know, she thinks about climate change, she thinks about conservation, she thinks about livelihood, and she thinks about interdisciplinary partnerships. I am excited to see what she has brought to us to think with. So on that note, I'm going to turn this over to Corrie and welcome you all. I'm going to put myself on mute and welcome you all throughout the talk to put things in chat if you like to, or signal me. I'm going to be kind of the backup person. And if you have an idea or a point or any issues, Beth Reddy, I'm here for you. And Corrie, please take it away.
All right, I'm starting a timer for myself in hopes that I can get through the slides and then have a great conversation with all of you. So today, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate my Western colleagues for connecting me to the Mines program. I really appreciate everyone who's tuning in to hear this presentation, and really look forward to the conversation we're going to have. My work today, what I'm going to try to share with you is kind of a melange of some different things. First, I'm going to talk to you about a paper where I explored kind of trends in collaborative science across disciplinary areas and across time. Then I'm going to share some personal experiences of my own work doing this kind of collaborative science, and then some reflections on what I feel like I've learned through the practice of it. And before I start, I wanted to get a kind of sense from my audience, which might be hard to do as there are so many of you, but I want you to think in your mind about these questions. You don't have to say anything out loud, but just think in your mind. I'm guessing I'm in a room of kindred spirits. I'm guessing that you're all here because you're interested in applied research or you're interested in humanitarian engineering. And so I just want you to think in your mind, what motivates you to do this kind of work? And so, you know, is it to make a difference? Are you interested in making a difference in the world? Is it about durable solutions, doing solutions that actually have traction and continuity over time? Is it the fact that these applied or humanitarian engineering projects are going to help you to have interesting experiences? You're going to get to go to other places, talk to other people. Is it the possibility of learning from locals? Is it the fact that you see the expertise in local communities and want to interact with that? Or is it really an ethical concern about working for equity? And it might be some of these, it might be none of these, but I just wanted to start off with a little bit of reflection about what motivates you for this type of work. So it's been over 10 years now that I've been doing this kind of approach to research or science. And over time, there have been so many types of approaches that connect science with action, or theory with practice. And so in my mind, I've come up with this idea of collaborative science, of science that attempts to work with communities in order to generate knowledge that is relevant, legitimate, and salient to decision making. And many of you are probably aware of David Cash's paper that talks about what makes knowledge usable, what makes it tractable on the ground. And it is these three qualities: relevance, legitimacy, and salience. And we have to recognize that everyone is going to understand those terms differently. What's relevant to you may not be what's relevant to someone in the community. What seems legitimate to you may not be legitimate to someone in a community. And so I want us to think about the way that different people are going to define these things. So I'm coming to you today really from a more transdisciplinary approach. Transdisciplinarity is about working across disciplines in a very integrative fashion, but it's also about working with community members. And so the actors change in a transdisciplinary approach. Not only are you doing interdisciplinary work, but you're trying to do it with people on the ground. Now, I know that many of you are coming from a humanitarian engineering background. And as I understand it, humanitarian engineering is engineering that works to solve real world problems in communities, oftentimes in developing countries, and does it in a way that pays attention to local context, local materials, local knowledge. And so in that way, I feel like this is part of the broad tent of collaborative science. But there are so many approaches that do this type of work. And so you may be familiar with some of these, some or all of them, but there are a lot of ways that scientists have tried to get out of the science box and connect with action. And before we really get into the core of the talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of the problems that we face. And many of you may be familiar with this Stacy diagram, but what this Stacy diagram does is it kind of outlines a matrix of different types of problems. And so when you get further from certainty, when you get further from agreement, you get into this complex world. And to be honest, these are the problems that really excite me. And I'm guessing they're the problems that excite many of you, but they're very different than other types of problems. So when you're close to agreement and close to certainty, you have simple problems. Maybe they're technical problems, maybe they're lack of knowledge problems, but they're fairly simple, and with technical expertise, you can solve them. When we get into this realm of complex problems, we need to reconsider who's part of that knowledge production. And so this is a slide that mirrors the other one that is looking at the nature of research approaches. So in this matrix from a paper by Mauser et al., you can see that on the x-axis, we're looking at the level of integration. And on the y-axis, you're looking about the types of participants that are part of that research. And so a lot of the work that I do is up in that upper right. And I think it really corresponds to the upper right of the nature of problems. When you don't have certainty, when you don't have agreement, it makes sense that you need multiple disciplines and that you need actors other than just those that are academic. So why would you ever want to use this sort of approach? I'm guessing you have your own reasons, but I'm going to share with you mine. The first thing that I really believe in is that these collaborative approaches have some significant personal benefits for researchers that decide to work in this way. You build relationships, you learn a lot from your collaborators. Oftentimes it makes you feel good about what you're doing. You also, I believe, have better information to inform problems. So instead of just relying on information from one discipline or even information from multiple disciplines, you're getting contextual, relevant, and applied information from people in those communities. And I really think it leads to better products. Also, there's an increased likelihood of having real world impact because people are part of the process. I hate the term buy-in. People say buy-in all the time for collaborative research approaches. And I really dislike that because what we're looking for is ownership. We're looking for commitment from communities. We're not looking to convince communities that our approach is the right one. And because of that, I think we can change our relationships with community partners, the relationship between people at universities and communities, relationships between community members, which is really exciting. And it's a more equitable approach. And so you're both sharing power and you're sharing resources. We are very privileged as folks living in the United States and having access to funding, having access to the educations that we've had. And these collaborative approaches can help us to share that power. And so I've just kind of provided a quick summary of what collaborative science is, what kind of problems it helps to address, what are the characteristics of it, and why you might use it. And now I'm going to run into 3 different sections. The first is about a review paper that I wrote and was published last year about trends in collaborative science. Then I'm going to run through 3 different sort of case studies, experiences of my own working in this work and talking about lessons learned. And then I want to open it up for reflections, and I'm hoping that we'll have time to share our knowledge with each other. So I'm going back to this just because, ooh, like, look at all those approaches. Oh my gosh, there's so many of them. And this honestly is what led me to want to do this following project. It's very fragmented, and as you'll see soon, it comes from many different disciplines. So this push toward bringing research to action comes from education, it comes from engineering, it comes from policy, it comes from development studies, it comes from natural science. So we're seeing pockets of this emerging in all of these different disciplines, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. And so in the literature, there are weaknesses that come up in several critiques of collaborative approaches. Things like inadequate attention to power relationships, things like inadequate attention to process and what process means for community members, the inability to generalize. And so you start solving the weaknesses of these many approaches by looking across them. And finally, our motivation was just to learn better how to transform science so that it serves and includes communities and stakeholders. So our 2 main questions were, what are the antecedents of a transdisciplinary approach? What's come before? And what can we learn from them? And this was published last year, and I think that the humanitarian engineering students will be reading it soon, but I'll give you a preview. The first thing that we did is we wanted to understand sort of over time what was happening with these approaches. And so this is a diagram that you'll be able to read it better in the paper, but basically each color is a different approach. And we found these in Web of Science through word searches. And we were able to create this diagram of the number of times that those words came up in peer-reviewed articles over time. And you can see this really interesting kind of inflection point. And I don't know exactly when it happens, but 2002, 2003, where you see it just explodes, and you're seeing so many more publications using these words and using these approaches. You can also see from this diagram that there are some approaches, like this blue is participatory action research. It's been around for a long, long time, but it also explodes at that point in time. And this is just sort of there were 9 different approaches that we used, and the way that we sort of constrained the approaches that we were looking at is we were looking for approaches that inform conservation. And so on the right side of this diagram, there's 9 different approaches in black. And then the dot is the first publication in that field ever. And the sort of names, the disciplinary names that are along that continuum just represent the fields that these approaches were coming from. And so, for instance, you can see participatory action research really had its roots in health and medicine studies, but also became very commonly used in education, development studies, and then has sort of transferred into conservation. And so over time, you can see the different disciplines that are using these types of approaches. And another thing, oh, well, sorry. I was on a different slide. There's 4 common themes that I'd like to talk about. The first is processes of learning. And we saw that some approaches were much better about thinking and articulating process than other approaches. And so we felt like there was a real possibility to learn across approaches because of this. For instance, like collaborative adaptive management is very much about process of learning. And so it talks a lot about that in the publications. All of them talk about integrating different ways of knowing, question who are the experts, bring in different forms of knowing to complement science. Power is something that comes up over and over again in the studies. Oftentimes, there's a lot of critique about the lack of attention to power, but some approaches like participatory action research really do an excellent job of thinking about power and could really inform other approaches that are trying to link research and action. And then finally, a lot of the research talks about the desire to lead to action, but few of them do it well and throughout the process. And so in the review, we found that there were approaches that would talk about action as an outcome of the research, and others that talked about action as something that was integrated and necessary for the whole process. And so they saw their research process as a type of action instead of as an outcome. And so these were all, you know, some of the interesting themes that came out of it. Here, I'm just going to show you a few diagrams from the paper, and you can see the approaches are there in the upper right-hand corner. This is showing from research to action and from low to high inclusivity and where these approaches kind of line up. And so you can see here that the circle is actually kind of the core of that approach. And then with colleagues, and I worked with, I think, 8 colleagues on this paper, through looking at the literature, we were able to think about where the range is for these in terms of not every project is at a specific point. And so we identified the range with the solid lines, and then the dotted lines are kind of what we see as the trajectory, or the newer articles that we reviewed are moving in that direction. And so with that, you can see that there is sort of a trend toward higher inclusivity and toward more action related approaches. And then this is a similar diagram, shows, you know, all of the approaches, but the matrix is showing low to high power sharing, and then a local scale to a global scale. And what we found is that really many of the approaches stay at the more local level, and that the local level approaches tend to have higher power sharing than approaches that are at larger scales. All right, so our conclusions, I'll be brief with this, are pretty much that the newer approaches have a lot to learn from previous approaches, especially in terms of effective process and power sharing. And so if we move beyond our individual discipline, there's a lot to be learned about these approaches and about how to do them well. Also, we really feel like, you know, looking at sort of that inflection point and the growth of these approaches in all of these different disciplines at the same time, it seems to us like this new way of doing science is really coalescing, that there is interest in synergy from a lot of different disciplines in doing this. And, you know, looking at our culture, looking at the critiques of science, we can see why this might be the case. Looking at the problems that we're facing that we need to solve, you know, there is a movement in this direction. And of course, we want to push forward toward this new form of doing science, but make sure that those unique traditions maintain their characteristics that fit to their purposes. So with that, I'm going to go into specific case studies. So maybe I'll pause for a second. I don't know, Beth, what you would prefer. I'd be happy to take some questions now, or I could keep going.
I think that there are enough people that I'm going to ask that if people have questions, they either enter it in the chat or they raise their hands.
Okay. Should I keep going then and then deal with those at the end, or do you want to do it now?
I think, do people have questions now? If that makes sense now, let's do it.
In the chat as well, if y'all don't want to cut in, then Beth can get a sense of how active the questioners are.
I mean, so far we have some questions from some professors, which I always welcome, but I wonder if people who aren't professors have questions to begin with.
And I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen. So if there's any that you want me to address, or I'll just go along and then we can talk about this more at the end.
I would like to let these questions kind of stimulate some of the other participants, and maybe address this more at the end, if that's okay, unless somebody wants to respond to one of these questions right now. Anybody?
Okay, I'm going to head forward. So the pause was nice because we can kind of switch gears and think about concrete projects in which a collaborative science approach was used. So this first project, and I'm just going to really briefly skim over these and hit some of the high points, but this project was looking at creating models of vegetation change over time. And these are being created for every soil type in North America. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to include both scientific knowledge from ecological field data, as well as local knowledge from long-term land users, land managers who had seen changes over time. And so the project, and I will move on to the next one, the project included stakeholders like ranchers, the National Resource Conservation Service, Colorado State University Extension, and we brought together interviews and field tours that were more social science with the ecological field data collection. And then we integrated these in these participatory research workshops where there were biologists and ecologists and ranchers and long-term land managers together thinking about how do we pull these elements together? How do we bring in what local people know and what ecological field data tells us? And where are there contradictions between these types of knowledge, and why might they be there? And so it really, helped to increase knowledge across producers and agency managers. I saw a lot of improved relationships and trust between people, and we did come up with some models of vegetation change that everyone could agree to. So that's the first project. The second project I want to talk about is a project in Gunnison, Colorado. And it's a project that the Nature Conservancy started, probably 7 years ago now. And it was bringing together a really wide range of stakeholders, agency folks, land managers, ranchers, recreationists, county employees, just a very large group of people. You can see the stakeholders up here. And when I came in, they had gotten close to doing their ecological vulnerability assessment, which was based on a literature review and some modeling work. I helped out with interviews to do a social vulnerability assessment. And then they had about 7 years of workshops where they brought people together. And the goals were really to come out with concrete adaptation actions. And so, again, knowledge was created, improved relationships and trust. And then really interestingly, there was one very concrete adaptation that came out of it, which was a wet meadow restoration project, which those of you that are in Gunnison probably know about this project and have toured it. It is an incredible collaborative effort in the area. All of the major land management agencies, CPW, Western students have been involved in this, and basically there have been, and I don't have the current number, but I think it's at least 60 watersheds that have had restoration projects happen in them. And the goal of these projects was to slow down water running through the system, increase forage growth, increase wildlife habitat, especially for Gunnison sage grouse. And so the participants, the people that were part of those workshops over the years saw it as a win-win solution for, ranching groups, for conservation groups, for local landowners, community members. So that was one outcome of that project. And then that project actually stimulated another project on endangered species management and decision-making with the Gunnison sage grouse. And in the course of meeting people and working with people during the climate change work, it came out of discussions that there was, you know, a real interest in understanding both what was known locally about Gunnison sage grouse from people that had personal observations of grouse, and then also what landowners were thinking of doing in response to a listing decision. And so this project, you know, included a lot of different stakeholders, brought together interviews and surveys with local folks, was co-designed with a biologist. And, you know, I think in a lot of ways helped to understand, there was a lot of concern in the area that there were going to be big changes because of a listing decision, that people were going to sell water, they were going to sell land. And part of the outcome of this project was really understanding kind of the collective pulse on what people were thinking of doing. And in fact, there was very little desire. There were a few key parcels that people were considering selling or selling water from, but it was not a landscape scale issue. And so I think that the project was really helpful in answering a very relevant local question. And we were also able to make a comment to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Sadly, I don't know if it's made any difference post-listing in terms of people's behavior. It would be hard to know that, but I do think that bringing those perspectives together and starting those conversations perhaps made people more comfortable with the fact that it was eventually listed, I hope. And so this is just a quick demonstration of kind of, you know, when you're thinking of working with community members and you're thinking of looking for who are the local experts, it's often hard. How do you define those people? How do you know who they are? This is a diagram representing a social network analysis that we did. And basically what was done is that we started with the Gunnison Sage Grouse Strategic Committee and asked each person to say, who are the 3 people that you think are most knowledgeable from personal observations about Gunnison sage grouse? And you can see here, we had ranchers, biologists, and long-term residents, and the bigger boxes are the ones that received more votes, I guess, for their expertise. And then these are the folks that we were able to interview. So we tried to really get at the center of that network of recommendations. And of course, this isn't perfect, but it gives some way of trying to assess who might be more knowledgeable about the species. And so now I'm going to move into reflections, and I want to talk a little bit about what I think the power is of community engagement. And first off, I just say that in my experience, I think that we tend to sometimes, as educated people who have degrees, discount the expertise of local community members. And we tend to think, well, we need their buy-in because they need to help support this project, but we don't see them as real knowledge co-producers. And I think it's really important, and I think a real power of it is if you approach community members as experts in their own right, by having that sort of inclusion, by approaching people in that really respectful way, and really looking for and expecting the fact that you're going to learn from them, partnerships can be better. I also feel like community members, oftentimes you hear people say, oh, you have to dumb it down for community members, or they're not going to understand uncertainty, so you have to speak with them in a different way. And I feel like oftentimes those sorts of observations are not really accurate. People navigate uncertainty regularly. If your livelihood depends on making a living off the land, you're going to pay attention to the factors that influence that. And so they often have very nuanced perceptions of it, but they don't speak the same language as we do. And so we have to think about how we communicate, how we talk to people. In the workshops from the first project I talked about, we saw the models that groups without researcher input we're making were like incredibly complex and included an incredible amount of uncertainty. And it was because people were trying to represent all of the uncertainty that they saw in the world. And so I think that uncertainty or complexity is something that people have a nuanced understanding of, but we often don't communicate in the same way about it. And also, you know, community members can implement ideas. So whether it's taking over a humanitarian engineering project and making sure that it's going to be durable for the long term, or deciding that, you know, they really love the project that you've worked on and they want to keep it going in the future. You know, by really deeply engaging in people, we can create work that is more durable in the future. And then I think that this is often overlooked in this type of work, but the more I think about it, the more I think that this is really the transformative piece of doing community engaged work, is that not only does it shift the dialogue or the discourse about specific topics, but it can also just change the underlying norms and the networks. And those are the things that are leverage points for further transformation. So if we can change the norms that people have about what they think about science, that has a longer and a longer lasting impact maybe than just one specific project. So I think that the power of community engagement is not just within the project, but it's in thinking about how the approach can transform the way that things are done. So now I want you guys to think a little bit, and I'm hoping that we can have a little conversation. So I want to start off by just thinking about, you know, I've talked about some of the reasons why I use a collaborative approach to science, but I want to hear from you about what I haven't mentioned, or what you think is important. Why do you use a collaborative approach in your science research scholarship world? I know there's so many of you that, but please chat if you want to contribute something here.
I have a question, but I want the students to speak. Go ahead, Lizzie. All right. My camera works back home.
I think that collaborations can be really a critical piece to developing public education at a local scale, and also just building broad community support for your project. So like you said, the longevity of the project, but if you can incorporate lots of different ways of knowing in lots of different sectors of your community into your project, then you have these citizens that are participating in the knowing. So they really take that information with them. And I think that the education piece is so much more influential in that way when they are doing that hands-on experiential learning.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely about social learning, and it's about sharing ideas. Does anyone else want to jump in about?
Haley Glover has a question that I'd like to share, if that's all right.
Sure.
She asks, I'm wondering, are there steps that can be taken kind of pre-interview or pre-survey that can develop a level of trust between community members and scientists to make interview results more effective and develop more collaborative relationships?
Yeah, excellent question, Haley. And there are a lot of things you can do, and I probably won't be able to talk about all of them, but some of my favorites are that I think it's very important that when we start a project, even a master's project, even when we have limited time, by listening. And oftentimes that means showing up where people are. So not necessarily asking them to just come to your presentation, but showing up where they regularly do meetings. So if it's the Soil and Conservation District, if it's the recreation, user group, whatever it might be, the local irrigators, whatever it might be, you show up at their meetings. Just introduce yourself and then listen. And I think that that can go really far. People will know you because you showed up. The other thing I'd say is know who the folks in the community are that I would call gatekeepers or keystones of that community, and get to know them, talk to them, have coffee with them, take them out for a coffee or a beer, and get to know them and explain your project, and then spend some time listening to. Don't ask for favors right away. You know, spend some time getting to know them, spend some time getting to know whether they're going to really be interested in what you're doing. And so I think that forging that kind of network goes a long way. Let's see, other things that I've done. I feel like oftentimes in qualitative research, we start off by sending a really form-looking letter to people with printed labels. Bad idea. Don't ever do that. Hand address note cards. You know, send a note card like this. You know, just something that is friendly and handwritten, and say, hey, I really want your thoughts on this, and then send them, if they respond to you, something that's more official, you know, an IRB approved, that is, you know, the exact wording that you want to share with them. But things like that go a long way. So that's just a few suggestions.
I have a couple more questions I'd love to share with you. The first one is from Joshua Weiss, who asks or says, I feel that collaboration is actually how something gets done. We as scientists or quote unquote experts can study and innovate the heck out of things, but sometimes I feel like we're just spinning our wheels to develop new ideas. I often question how much these new ideas are actually put into action.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the best thing to do is develop those new ideas in partnership, figure out where the need is and develop it there. Don't, you know, there's a place for science to go off in its own direction and discover a really relevant question that no one's asking. That's perfectly fine use of science. It should happen. But sometimes we should also just listen to where the interest is and design projects around what people want to know and what will inform their decision making. And I think the best scientists can think, oh, this is the applied use of this project. What is the more theoretical? How does this influence the way we do science? Or how does this influence some of the theories that are already out there? So I think you can do both. But I agree with you that collaboration is the way that things generally work in the world.
Our next question is from Annette Wilson, who asks, how do you initiate community collaboration when you're an outsider to this community? So do you have any tips specifically for students who want to be part of communities that might be abroad?
Oh, great question, and really, really hard. Tap anyone that you know that knows that community. And I know that, you know, at Western, Sally and Jess do a lot of traveling and connecting with folks in different communities. So have a conversation with them and figure out, you know, what have you heard? What do you hear from the communities that you're visiting? Also reach out to folks, depending on the type of project that you have, you know, that run NGOs or, you know, in whatever field you're thinking of going into, figure out some folks in that community that you can have preliminary conversations with. And I would start there. I mean, unless, I think the challenge is for 2-year projects, you have a very limited amount of time and you kind of have to build off of something that maybe already has some legwork into it. And so you can rely on your professors and what they know about, you know, or you can say, I'm going to spend a year in this place and extend my program. And that's another approach, but a harder one.
I'm going to jump ahead. I'll jump back soon in the queue, but this one just seemed like a really good place to go from there. It's from Juliana Valenzuela, who asks, based on your experience working with collaborative science projects, what are some of the barriers you come across when working with other engineers or scientists? Do you get pushback with these ideas? And if so, can you give an example about that and how you might deal with it?
Yes. Yes and yes, lots of barriers. So I have some slides later on where I was going to talk about that, but I'll just talk about it now. I think, so from colleagues, Yes, definitely. If you're trying to do an interdisciplinary collaboration and you have a colleague that comes from a different discipline and has never done this type of work, they might be scared of it. They might not understand how it works. They might be so driven by their own research questions that they don't want to open them up at all. So one thing I found is that you really want to build transdisciplinary partnerships off of relationships that you have, off of people that you know and respect. And if you need a type of expertise and you don't know that person yet, sometimes you just have to start developing some new relationships so that you can do that. Bigger constraints for this type of work, I'd say funding for one. Like, nobody wants to fund you going and talking to communities about what they need to know. So that relationship building part of this work is really challenging to get funded. And I think we're seeing some hopeful signs that some different funders are taking transdisciplinary approaches seriously and funding them, but it is still a constraint. Of course, academic incentives and you know, whether you're going for tenure and you need a ton of publications, well, transdisciplinary research takes a while. And so you want to sort of carefully select what you become a part of and be really, I guess that one of my points later on was going to be, you know, be really selective about where you think you can make the most difference in terms of your expertise, your time, your relationships with the community members. Not every project should be a collaborative science approach. So you need to choose carefully too.
While we're thinking about stakeholder, there are some amazing questions coming through. But I'm going to fuse two together. One is from Rachel Geiger and one is from Dana Lehman. So Rachel asks, do you have any suggestions for how to establish a common language or communication between stakeholders and community and scientists to allow collaboration? And Dana's question is similar. How is collaborative science a practice of humility? Can we think about humility here?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take those, well, I was going to take them separately, I think. And I'll answer actually that second one first, because you hit it spot on. Like, humility is all that this is about. And it really is about learning to listen in a way that's open to you being wrong. And I don't know how many of you are aware of kind of this idea of single, double, and triple loop learning, but it's a really interesting and useful concept for thinking about this type of work. So single loop learning, you try something, it works or it doesn't work, and you try something else. Double loop learning, you're kind of reframing what your assumptions are about the system. And triple loop learning, you're actually thinking about your paradigms, these larger things, and maybe how your paradigm is stopping up the research project. And so oftentimes I find that it definitely challenges you to think in new ways. And so you have to be aware of the fact that you are a bounded individual with bounded knowledge, and no human being likes to think that their assumptions about the world are wrong. But in this type of approach, you often have to rethink those assumptions often. And then, sorry, could you remind me what the first one was?
I have to scroll up really quickly. I think I was framing Rachel's question about how to establish a common language.
Language.
Communication strategy between multiple groups in a collaboration. Yeah.
This often doesn't get enough attention in a collaborative effort. And I know I've had some issues, problems, disasters with it in the past. When you really think you're all on the same page, and then halfway through the collaboration, you realize that there's a term that you're all using that everyone has a different definition for. And so I've actually had the experience where I was halfway through and we had to sit down and have an all-day workshop and think about what those different terms mean. I think the biggest thing is, and sometimes this has to happen just across disciplines, and sometimes it has to happen with community members, but I think you have to come to some agreement. And sometimes it's about terms, but to tell you the truth, I think oftentimes it's more about goals. And one of the things that I'm starting to do in my own work is really, when I start a project, think about ask community members, what would success look like to you? Then reflect on what would success look like to me in this project, and really think about who this project is going to serve. Like, is it really going to serve community members in meeting what they think success looks like? So I think that terminology is definitely important and critical, and it would be best to have conversations with collaborators about that at the beginning. But I think even more important is being really realistic and honest about what you want from the project and what collaborators want from it, and whether you can meet all of those demands.
I have a question that is actually developed collaboratively between two of our participants. So this isn't a Frankenstein question that I'm going to try to force on you, but it's a naturally flowing question. And it is from Ellie Orr and Joshua Wise, who ask together, what are some tips for dealing with pressure either from the community to produce a certain kind of result from your research, or from your peers?
Oh, yeah. And I've actually seen efforts fall apart because there has been this type of pressure. So this is a question about pressure for a specific type of result. And I think that oftentimes coming into a partnership like this or a project, you want to be really clear about what the aim of what your aim of the project is, and have a discussion about what the aim of other people's projects are. To be really frank, when I started the Gunnison Sage Grouse project, I was in a county commissioners meeting, and one of the county commissioners asked me something about, like, well, what if we find something that we don't want in this research? Like, what if we find something that's anti to what we want to find? And I said, well, the aim of the research is to answer the research questions and not to sort of censor what comes out of it. And so that was a conversation in that project that I had pretty early on, and had to have a follow-up conversation after that to say, you know, this is where I'm coming from. These are my aims for this. This is how I'm going to collect the data. You can provide input on how I'm collecting it, on, you know, my methods, things like that. But once the data is collected, and of course it would be a dialogue, they can't, you know, determine those things, but once that data is collected, that data is what it is. And, you know, I had to sort of say, I'm going to publish regardless of what the data that we find is. And, you know, sometimes that is hard on more controversial issues to come to that kind of agreement about where you want to be. But this is part of like selecting when a collaborative effort will work and will not work. And if there's explicit demand for one type of research outcome, you know, I think that that's a place where maybe you say, I'm sorry, I have to step back. I can't do that in good faith.
I think we have a couple more questions. Some are focused on sort of practice and some on big theory stuff, but we also have, you know, less than 10 more minutes scheduled. And I'm so happy that everybody was able to join us for this time. But I want to ask you, Corrie, how you want to spend your last 7 minutes. Should we take some more questions? Should we move forward?
I'm happy to take more questions. I only have a few more slides. There's a few where I was going to ask folks to reflect on their own experience of collaborative science, but I think that if folks have questions, I'd be happy to answer those before moving on to anything else.
Okay, so in that case, it will not surprise you to know that your colleague, John Hausdorfer, and mine, Juan Lucena, both are curious about power, and power in the context of environmental justice movements, in participatory methods. How do you feel about how power is distributed? For example, when we talk about participation in community engagement, how do we think about power there?
Yeah, so it's like the biggest question. It really is the biggest question. I have a project right now where I'm interviewing folks across a range of disciplines about their transdisciplinary practice and how they're integrating power and how they think about power in those relationships. So I'm doing, you know, a little work right now to actually explore how people who do this type of research think about it. I guess from my personal perspective, I think that it's very unfortunate the fact that oftentimes in collaborative science, we ask for participation, we ask for knowledge, we ask for people's observations, but we don't share the power of decision making. So we don't share the power of who gets to define the research questions, how we analyze the data, how we interpret the data, what the outcomes are going to be. And so this is a very big issue, I think, and something that is shifting the way that I'm thinking about doing these types of projects. One thing that I'd say is that I think that being explicit about the power relationships that exist. So I'm thinking now about a project that I had in Alaska with rural indigenous communities near Denali National Park. And it didn't start out this way because I was too naive when I started the project to know that power was an issue. But there was a moment where I had a conversation with tribal leaders that was very explicit about the types of power that were influencing the project and how to navigate those. And I think sometimes, so there's the power of having the funding, there's the power of an education, there's the power of being a tribal leader, there's the power of age, there's the power of gender, there's all these different things that play into the way that any kind of a project runs. And so I guess that my first recommendation would just be being explicit and open about that and having conversations about it, and also having conversations about how a community wants the power to be shared. In a lot of projects, people are asked to participate without a compensation for time, without, attempts made at, providing childcare, providing bus passes, providing things that people need if they're going to participate in something. And so I think those two things, being explicit and open and having conversations with key partners, and then also being inclusive in the sense of thinking through what it takes for someone to participate, and not just assuming in a lot of collaborative efforts, there are people that are paid to participate. So there's the agency representatives, there's the NGO representatives, they're getting paid to be at the table. If you're a representative of a minority community, you often are not being paid to be at the table. And so thinking strategically about how you work on that, and then speaking to people that you would like to participate to see what is equitable, what's fair, what will allow their participation.
Thank you so much. We have a couple more questions about ways of getting people involved. Just how we encourage people from specifically in suburban or inner city publics, or just how we encourage anybody to get involved in our community-oriented projects. How do we recruit people? How do we involve people? And how do we prepare ourselves to do that?
Tapping into networks is incredibly important. Thinking clearly about who you want to participate and figuring out how to find them. I guess I'd reverse. This is assuming that you already know what the research question is. I guess I'd reverse and say, at first, designing the research question with community members can really help. And, there are ways to find a partner who is maybe a link to a community who has an interest in the topic that you're working on. When I was a very early graduate student, I was part of a project in Denver that was looking at health, and it was like obesity, blood pressure, something else, but it was like a locally engaged effort to improve the health of local communities. And it was one of the first times that I had ever been exposed to this more collaborative effort. And I was amazed by the participation. I was amazed by the turnout at every single one of the meetings. But every meeting had healthy food. They always served meals. Every meeting had daycare for the kids. Every meeting they handed out free bus passes if you needed a bus pass to get there next week. and the whole effort had been designed in partnership with some key community leaders and this researcher. And so it was addressing something that people cared about in the community. So yeah, being clear about if your question really connects with people and then making it easy for them to get involved.
I love that. Thank you so much. So we're gonna, let's steer away from the questions for now. I think we got all of them taken care of one way or the other. But
Okay.
Do you want to see us out?
Awesome. Let me look. Oh, we're at time, aren't we? Yeah, I was just going to see if I had any time to share anything else, but I just want to thank you guys. This has been impressive. I've noticed that we went, you know, I think at our high point, like maybe 80 folks on. So thank you all for being engaged. Thank you for being here. Thanks for being interested in this type of work. Anyone can find me. My Wyoming address is pretty easy to Google. Although if you Google me, you might still find me at Western because I don't think I've been removed from that website yet, but look for the one at Wyoming. You'll get me through that one. But if people have questions or want advice, I've met with lots of students that are interested in doing this and would be happy to share advice. So that's all I got.
The chat is just a parade of thank yous from people.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that I would have a hard time imagining you're not going to have some folks following up on that, if not more.
Yeah, feel free. And we can do, you know, one session with a bunch of people, or we can do individual sessions if folks have questions. So, yeah.
And Corrie, you know, for the students just starting out graduate school, I love your definition of an expert in here. An expert is somebody navigating complex nuance, right? Not someone with a certain credential, not someone with a certain level of information in their head, right? Someone capable of navigating complexity and nuance. And it's almost like you're not just changing who you work with in terms of who's a producer of knowledge. You first change, what does an expert mean? What does it mean to be an expert? And then that opens up, who do you work with? Is that fair characterization?
Yeah, and I'd say that, you know, the most important thing, you know, when you're starting a project like this is really thinking about who are the experts for my, like for where I'm interested in, for this intersection that I'm interested in. Because I think that it's true that like not everyone has all types of expertise, but, you know, if you're interested in irrigation and water efficiency, you know, you got to talk to people that have been, you know, irrigating for a long time. You have to talk about people who produce snow at the ski area. I mean, you have to think about what the problem is, and then who knows about that from a practice-oriented approach, and how could their perspective help to influence your question or what you're approaching? Because oftentimes I mean, I come from a background where, you know, I had some experience along the way, but a lot of the information I've received is through schooling. And so, you know, there is something to be said for people who have been experiencing specific systems in specific ways. And we should, you know, both honor that knowledge and then also constantly, like with any type of knowledge, be critical, you know, be skeptical, ask questions, don't just take things at face value, but also don't just discount things because someone is a minor and not a professor. So.
Well, I wish I'd heard this my second week of grad school. So thank you for this gift to students from both programs, and Elizabeth and Julia and Juan. And I'm seeing a lot of new colleagues, faces I haven't met yet. It's really an honor for Wes to be involved in this partnership. I'm excited to see what comes of it. Students from both programs, please challenge us, the faculty, on ways you can get to know each other informally and formally. We're trying to cook some things up on the faculty level, but push us. Make sure it speaks to you. And thanks again, Dr. Knapp. And Beth, I'll let you, Dr. Reddy, I'll let you wrap things up. I didn't mean to jump in there, but my camera finally works. So I wanted to make sure I thanked everyone.
John, we're happy we had you in whatever form we got you for as long as we could. Thank you all for coming. I wonder if we still have 36 whole people. Do you think that we could take ourselves off mute for a minute just a minute, just a second, a minute being the hyperbolic small minute rather than the hyperbolic big minute, to give Dr. Corrie Knapp a round of applause, because that was fabulous and insightful and generous. 1, 2, 3, let's go.
Thank you.
I know it's strange to be giving a talk in this forum, and hopefully some other time we can do it all in person and cheer for you very, very loudly indeed, and surround you at the podium and refuse to let you go even when your talk is over, and just ask you all of our questions.
Oh, see, I'll show you what will be waiting for me. This is why I won't be able to. I didn't quite get to this, but yeah, there they are. That's what would take me away from the podium.
Oh,
So that's my
beautiful.
little inspiration for the work that I do. So yeah.
Good stuff, Corrie.
Yeah. Take care. Thank you all.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corrie.
And all will be in touch with the recording of this amazing conversation. So, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.